Unit 5, Lesson 13. True or false rational numbers. Decide if each statement is true or false and be prepared to explain your reasoning. So let's look at number 1. Number 1 says negative 38.76 times negative 15.6 is negative. If the numbers are right next to each other, that means that you're multiplying. So negative times a negative, they're saying is a negative. That is false. Negative times a negative is a positive. So this one is false. Number 2, 10,000 minus 99,999 is less than 0. Well, I know if I'm taking 10,000 and subtracting 99,000 from it, that's already going to give me a negative number, and a negative number is less than 0, so true. 3/4 times negative 4/3 equals 0. These are the reciprocals of each other, even though one is positive and one is negative. If I multiply them, 3 times 4 is 12, 4 times 3 is 12. 12 over 12 equals 1. Positive times a negative is a negative. So this answer would be negative 1. Negative 1 does not equal 0. So that is false. And the last one, 30 times negative 80, well, that would give us negative 2,400 minus 50 equals 50 minus 30 times 80, positive times a negative is a negative 2,400, which these two become a plus sign. They both cancel out and become a plus. Well, two negatives over here, 2,400 negative minus 50 more, that's going to be a bigger negative. That's going to be a negative 2,450, where this is 50 plus 2,400, so this is a positive 2,450. These are not equal to each other, even though the answers will become the same number. One is going to be a negative, where the other one is a positive. So this one is false as well. Let's move on. Okay, so let's see. Near and far from 0. For each set of values for A and B, evaluate the given expressions and record your answers in the table. So what it's saying is for A, we're going to use this one first, negative 1/2. And then here we're going to fill in what it would be. So we're going to do the first line together first. Negative A, or you could also think of this as the opposite of A. When you see a negative sign in front, you could think the opposite of. So the opposite of A, the opposite of negative 1/2 is positive 1/2. That would be the first one. Negative 4 times B, and we're saying in this situation B is 6. So negative 4 times 6. 4 times 6 is 24, and then negative times a positive is a negative. So negative 24. The opposite of A, so opposite of negative 1/2 is positive 1/2, plus 6, because B is 6. 1/2 plus 6 is 6 and 1/2. And if you wanted to put 0.5 there, that would be fine. A divided by the opposite of B. A is negative 1/2. I'm going to do that over here. Negative 1/2 divided by the opposite of B. So the opposite of 6 is negative 6. Well, I can't take a fraction and divide it, so I keep, change, and flip. Instead of negative 6 over 1, it'll be negative 1 over 6. 1 times 1 is 1. 2 times 6 is 12. Negative times a negative is a positive. Because this was a negative 1/2 and this was a negative 1/6. Positive 1/12 for this answer. A squared. Well, A is negative 1/2. And the squared means to write the number this many times and multiply it. So I'm going to write negative 1/2 twice, and then I'm going to multiply it. 1 times 1 equals 1, 2 times 2 equals 4, Negative times a negative is a positive. So 1/4 is my answer here. And then b cubed. Instead of a 3 exponent, that just means you could also say cubed. That means we're going to take that number, write it 3 times, and multiply them. 6 times 6 is 36, and 36 times 6 is 216. And it was a positive, so positive 216. So what I'd like you to do now is try to solve each of the next row. Pause the video, try to solve the next row, and then I'm going, when I pause my video, it'll restart with the new work over here. So go ahead and pause it. Okay, so if you look over here, this is new work now. This answer would have been a negative 1/2 because it's the opposite of A. 4 times 6 is 24. Negative times a negative is a positive. The opposite of 1/2 is negative 1/2, so negative 1/2 plus B was a negative 6. Well, if you have plus a negative, that means subtract, or you are combining two negatives. So negative 6.5. 1/2 divided by the opposite of B. Well, the opposite of a negative is a positive. So 1/2 divided by 6 means multiply by 1/6, 1/12. A squared, 1/2 squared is just 1/4 again. And B cubed, negative 6 times negative 6 times negative 6 is negative 216 because negative times a negative is a positive. Positive times a negative is a negative. Pause the video again and try the last row. Okay, and checking the last row. Opposite of negative 6 is positive 6. 4, negative 4, I should say, times negative 1/2. Negative 4 times negative 1/2. You could just put 4 over 1 and go 4 times 1 is 4, 1 times 2 is 2, negative times a negative is a positive, and then 4 divided by 2 is 2. So 2 is the answer here. The next one, opposite of negative 6 is positive 6, plus B is negative 1/2. Plus a negative means subtract, so 6 minus 1/2 is 5.5. A, which is negative 6, divided by the opposite of negative 1/2 is positive. Can't take 6 and divide it by a fraction, so you multiply it by its reciprocal. Negative 6 times 2 is negative 12 over 1, which is the same as negative 12. Negative 6 squared, negative 6 times negative 6 is positive 36. And negative 1/2 cubed, 1 times 1 times 1 is 1. 2 times 2 is 4 times 2 is 8. Negative times a negative is a positive, times a negative is a negative. And make sure you don't put a 6 here, because that doesn't mean 2 times 3. That means 2 times 2 times 2. So 2 times 2 is 4 times 2 is 8. Then, and if you have any questions on any of these, please come up and ask me. So looking at number 2, for table when A was negative 1/2 and B was 6, so in this row, which expression has the largest value? Well, looking at them, the largest value is 216. Which expression has the smallest value? Well, negative 24 is the smallest out of all of those. And which one is closest to 0? 1/2 is close to 0. It's closer than negative 24. It's closer than 6.5. But 1/12 is actually closer to 0 than 1/2. Because if you think of it, if you have 1/2 and 1/12, and we need to make equivalent fractions, 1/2 is the same as 6 over 12, and 6 over 12 is larger than 1 over 12, so that would be farther away from 0. 1/12 and 1/4, same type of concept. Instead of 1/4, if I want to make that out of 12, that would be 3/4 or 3/12. 3/12 is farther away from 0 than 1/12 is. So our closest to 0 is 1/12. Try this one. See if you can do it. Just pause the video and then restart it. The largest value in this one is 24. That is worth the most because that's the largest whole number. It has the largest value that's more than 0. So 24. Smallest value, negative 216. And closest to 0, again, would be the 1/12. Try the last one and then restart the video. The largest value is 36. Smallest value, negative 12. And closest to 0, let's see, so far 2 is the closest. Oh, but we have negative 1/8, and that would be the closest to 0. All right. This last piece we're not going to go over on the video. If you want to log into Unit 5, Lesson 13, Seagulls and Sharks again has a lot of practice that you can do. You can move the shark and the seagull around. It gives you questions to try. So if you want to try that in your book, you are welcome to do that. And then you could come up and ask me questions about it once you're done if you would like to have more practice on this.